Hi, this is Holly, co-host of I'm a Fan of That. I'm just jumping in to let you know that my book, A History of Fans and Fandom, The Power and Passion of Fan Culture, is out now and available in all good bookshops, online and on Amazon. So please go out there, buy that book for your friends and family, and get nerdy and learn a bit about fandom with us. Thanks!
Hi, this is Vivian Asimos, and my book, Cosplay and the Dressing of Identity, is available for pre-order right now, coming out in September. You can pre-order it through the publisher's site, which is Reaction with a K, or through any major book retailers and on Amazon. So go pre-order! Thanks!
Woo! Hello, and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, a podcast about all things fandom, told through objects, stories, and studies, with a bit of silliness thrown in along the way. Your hosts on this journey are Dr. Vivian Asimos, public anthropologist and pop culture academic, and me, pop culture writer and journalist, all-round enthusiast, Holly Swinyard. Join us as we deep dive into the wonderful and wacky world of fan culture, its history, the people who make it up, and the way we look at this ever-growing part of our society. Fair warning, we may well talk about some adult themes, use some adult language, and possibly get a bit nerdy about the whole thing. You have been warned.
Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, where we talk about the wonderfully complicated worlds of fandom through the objects we love. I am Vivian Asimos.
And I am Holly Swinyard.
And today is one of those days where, once again, we do not own the object.
The object does exist, though.
It does exist.
It's not an imaginary object this time.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think they've always been real objects. I just have always wanted the object. It's an object of desire.
And isn't that the best thing? Because otherwise we have very cluttered houses, and I think we already both do a little bit.
A little bit. But today, I wanted to start with a very interesting print that I'm going to say it's a Tom of Finland. It's also associated with Vivian Westwood. If I am wrong in any of these accounts, there will be an edit inserted now. Okay, so... But it's an image of two male cowboys facing each other with some penises out.
They're very out. They're very there.
And they're very penis.
Yeah, they're very definitely happening.
There's a lot of everything going on.
Yeah.
And it's been printed on t-shirts. It's associated with the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, if you know the Sex Pistols, you'll have seen this image.
Yes.
It's very part of their merch and all that kind of stuff. You literally Google this image and it's Sex Pistols, Sex Pistols, Sex Pistols, that's it. You know?
Yeah. And I wanted to bring this because last season we talked about the lovely and amazing Orville Peck. In that we talked a little bit about cowboys and the nature of cowboys, but we were always framing it in the way that Orville Peck took cowboys, and I talked a lot about masks because our object at that point was Orville Peck's mask. But today I wanted to talk a little bit more about just cowboys more generally.
Yeah.
But not the historical cowboys.
No, the myth.
A little bit.
Yeah. Sort of the myth of the cowboy.
The fandom of cowboys, because that's what we're here for.
I do think it's important that we kind of do a little quick historical what were cowboys, because I think otherwise the myth of the cowboy, the fandom around cowboys, does not make... It's difficult to understand it if you don't really understand the historical context. So cowboys were not what you see in films.
Yes.
Cowboys were almost entirely non-white, people of colour. They would have been ranch hands.
Mexicans as well.
Exactly. You also would have had a lot of women kicking around in the cowboy kind of area, that kind of thing. And it wasn't sort of men going off and shooting up towns and all that kind of thing. They were essentially guys running ranches and protecting the cattle and being out there for days on end, all this kind of thing. I think the closest I've seen in media to represent this, weirdly, is Brokeback Mountain, even though it is two white dudes. But that kind of thing of them being out there for so long and, like, away from people and all that kind of stuff. Not just running around shooting shit up and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, the spaghetti westerns are much more samurai movies than they are cowboy movies. let's be honest.
Well, yes, and that's kind of, I mean, that was part of the problem with them. Yeah. Not at the time, but in looking back, is that they actually did often rip off the samurai movies, but do them in white people ways.
Yeah. So, the cowboys of myth and legend that we have, the stories that are told about cowboys, they're romanticized retellings of folklore or stories from other cultures, particularly the Japanese stories. You can see like things like the Clint Eastwood films are very clearly samurai wandering from town to town, you know, that kind of like shogunate type story, which just wasn't what they were. And I think it's important to recognise the difference, because otherwise it gets very confusing.
Yes. And that's why we were trying to draw a distinction of talking about the fandom of cowboys.
Yeah.
Because there is an important difference. Although, like you say, I think knowing that there is a difference is very important. Mm-hmm. Especially because the retelling of it in popular culture, particularly in like the 50s and 60s, really did whitewash an entire population of people that, like you say, they were, a large amount of them were Black and Hispanic and women or trans people. There's a history of trans people and non-binary people that are cowboys.
Yeah. And I think people are drawn to cowboys because while the popular image of cowboys doesn't look like that, it still maintains that mythos of otherness, of being an outsider, being a rebel, all these kind of things. So they took what the personality of the cowboy was, I guess, the stereotype of the idea, and placed it onto white men, when actually it had been legitimate people who were outside of the what at the time was the norm in any way, shape or form. I mean, it kind of still is, but particularly then, these were people who were even legitimate citizens. Some of them would have been freed slaves, escaped slaves. Many of them would have been people looking for a better life that they weren't able to get anywhere else, like you said, like maybe people coming through from Mexico, or women, or all this kind of thing. People who were looking to change who they were and what their circumstances were in one way or another in a space where they could be free. And that being placed onto white cisgender men is, straight white cisgender men is quite an entertaining idea, but still.
As the podcast's resident American, I think that there was this weird capturing of the freedom element that you were talking about, but presented in such a weird way, where, because America is obsessed with freedom, in case people didn't know.
What? I had no idea.
It's this weird obsession that they also have this perception that they're the only country that has ideologies of freedom, which is really weird. Have you ever seen Chicken Run?
Yeah.
The first one.
Yeah.
There's one of my favorite moments in that is because it's an American guy and he's like, "Oh, I'm from the land of the free and the home of the brave." And this one chicken goes, "Scotland!" It's like my favorite bit in the whole one. But, like, there was somebody on Twitter at one point who said something about, like, "Oh, I feel bad for these French people that don't know freedom." And they were like, "What are you talking about?"
I think the French are pretty good at freedom.
Yeah, no, they did some heavy guillotining to get that freedom. Like,
and they're very good at protesting.
Oh, God, yeah.
Complete side note, have you seen the little barbecues they can put in the tram lines, and then as they're walking on protest they have it on wheels and they move the barbecue with them?
No.
It's amazing. Like, that's how good they are at protesting.
I love it. What was amazing was I was a sidetrack completely. I was in Paris when a load of the recent ones were really kicking off, because it was like March of last year.
Yeah. And
I was there with a group of Americans. And the amount of them that were, like, complaining about it and stuff, and it's like, well, this is what you talk about as being what makes stuff. But again, I think this kind of goes back to the cowboy, is that when they talk about freedom, they mean a very specific kind, and a very specific demonstration of which, historically, was not really what the cowboy represented, but it get tied up to this idea of Western expansion and manifest destiny, and this idea that white people should take over this land and, you know, bar whoever's going to stand in their way. and the cowboys represented that Western frontier and the hardworking white person in these representations.
Yeah. We talked about it a bit in the Orville Peck episode as well, the idea that I think country music falls into this category as well. That when you think of country music now, you think of this all-American, I love my guns and my cars. And,
I call it bro country.
Yeah.
It's like...
Whereas, like, country in its roots is it's about unions, it's about the working class, it's about the underdog. A lot of country, again, comes from black people. It comes from, if you even go back to the roots of, like, folk music, which is where you have to go back to, it's all about, it's definitely about sex, death, and drink, but it's also about the world is difficult and we're struggling, but how can we make that better and what do we do? And it's about being united in that. And I think, again, that falls into the same thing as the cowboy, of it's been literally whitewashed into being I like my guns and my cars and that's what freedom looks like.
Yeah.
Which is not what it is, you know.
And I find the cowboy really fascinating because I think it's an ideology in pop culture that has permeated beyond just Westerns. So I, in preparation for this, I read a really amazing book, I will link it, that is essentially an edited volume of academic studies of the cowboy in 20 and 21st century pop culture.
Okay.
And some of it is directly cowboys, like Brokeback Mountain and discussions like this. But a lot of it is taking that perception of the cowboy and what it came to represent in pop culture and how that has become embodied in other bits.
Okay.
So my favorite one, and it was the primary chapter that I read, no offense to any other chapter writers that are out there, but it was somebody that did a whole thing on the private eye, and particularly in noirs, and how they are cowboys.
Yeah. They are, and that makes perfect sense.
They're the outcasts, they're on the fringes of society, they're pushing, but they're embodying that white, male, masculine, again, perception of cowboys in pop culture, and really embodying it, and it becomes this Americana, is, the Maltese Falcon, and
absolutely.
These...
the Long Goodbye, all that kind of stuff. They do feel they have a very similar... As somebody who loves noir, I read a lot of noir. I think those stories, you have to have that same thing of this person is the outsider. They are misunderstood. They come into town and they leave after solving the problem in some way, which again is the samurai story, right? It's the thing of the story of samurais from Japan is that they were wandering and they would come into a place, they'd fix something for somebody in one way or another, and then they'd leave again and they'd go to the next place. And that's what the cowboy story is. You think of the man with no name, that's literally what happens. He comes in, he solves the problem, he fucks off again. He's the man with no name, he has nowhere to be. And I find it very interesting, like, that point of the noir detective is the same role, because a noir detective is not the same as your Sherlock Holmeses, your Poirots, all that kind of stuff, who everybody knows who they are. They don't get that anonymity. The PI is the person who's, he's completely down on his luck and you only go to him when you cannot go to anybody else. Yeah. And that then kind of reflects into sci-fi stories as well. You think about your Han Solo is a cowboy, right? Mm-hmm. He's got his horse and his mate and they turn up and they solve the problem and they shoot some things and they leave. That's Han Solo. And I think that's kind of funny that you kind of see that again, which Star Wars is very heavily influenced by Western films, is also very heavily influenced by Japanese cinematography. It's also very heavily influenced by World War II's films, which were again influenced by cowboy films. So it's like this circular thing of seeing this narrative come back over and over again. Yeah.
If I was more interested in history, it would be really fun to create like a web of influence in pop culture, kind of working backwards as far back as we can go, of how one thing spawns these things that then spawns these things that...
Because I think there would be an argument for even things like you can draw a direct comparison between cowboys and the samurai. I think you could also draw that comparison between cowboy narrative and mythology and, say, the Arthurian legends. A knight goes off to solve a problem and does the thing, defeats the dragon, gets the girl, comes home. You know, so it's slightly less comes out of nowhere and disappears into nowhere. But it's still the same idea of a manly, masculine, manly man goes off, does the thing, is special for whatever reason, fights his tasks, and comes back. Which is something you also see in Greek mythology. It's something you see... It's a very specific way of talking about masculinity, is you are the only person who can solve this problem because you are special for some reason. You are the outsider, or you've been chosen, or all this kind of stuff. I kind of feel like they all... While it's not directly and obvious thing, you can see the link that comes through of masculine narratives, because Cowboy is a very masculine narrative now. And I think that's why it's interesting that we see it so much in queer narratives. Because it's like, how far towards masculine do you go before you come back around the other side?
There seems to be a weird point where it starts circling back in on itself, and it's like, oh, you've gone too far, and now you're so masculine that it's homoerotic?
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really cool about this Tom of Finland print, where these are buff dudes, and they are manly dudes, and they are dressed in a way that it recalls this kind of extreme masculinity, and they have extreme masculinity endowed upon them.
Yeah.
And yet, the image itself is so gay.
Yeah, it's incredibly homoerotic. Incredibly so. And, like, you see guys dressed like that at Pride.
Oh,
you know, it's a big thing. You'll see everything from, like, your adorable little twink guys wearing feather boas and a pink cowboy hat to a guy in complete leather with, like, a full Stetson kind of thing. And and you're like, you're still embodying the same idea of the cowboy. And that's really cool. What I do think is very interesting, we're going to talk about how manly cowboys are, is why is it that we don't call them horse boys when we have horse girls? Because it's the same damn idea. I'm sorry, if you're so obsessed with horses that this is your whole vibe, you get called a horse boy.
Oh.
But even cowgirl has a huge amount of connotations with it. If you're, cowgirl has a whole, it's a whole subcategory of porn, isn't it? Like, you don't, we've just talked about how there is gay porn about cowboys, or like a queerness to it. But I don't think if you said cowboy to somebody, they'd automatically think of homoerotic things. Whereas if you say cowgirl to somebody, they're automatically going to think about a sexy girl in sort of a little skirt and a hat,
Is there anything associated with women that wouldn't immediately recall some kind of sexualization, though?
No, because women aren't allowed to exist as humans outside of men's gratification, so... What are you going to do about it? But to get back on track, the queer narratives around cowboys are, I think, it's hard not to see a level of homoeroticism in guys hanging out in a field together for long periods of time with nobody else there, and getting very, emotional with each other. And that's a good thing. Men should be allowed to do that without it being, inherently... but then that comes down to negative stereotypes around queer men, which are unwarranted and unfair. So it's
it's an effect of toxic masculinity, because once again, toxic masculinity also harms cis hetero men.
Yeah.
They are not allowed to show emotion or have very good, solid, loving male relationships. All of these things that are portrayed onto them that then hurts mental health, and there's high suicide rates because of toxic masculinity.
I remember when Brokeback Mountain, and it's hard to talk about cowboys and not talk about Brokeback Mountain.
Yes, we have to. We will talk about...
When that came out and the reaction... obviously at the time it was making a queer movie at all was a big deal.
Yes.
But making a queer movie about cowboys was... And with these two actors, particularly, like Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger, who are very masculine actors and all that kind of thing. And both had just come off doing sort of these sort of big budget movies and things. People were so not okay with it. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of guys who I think they went wanting a cowboy movie and they got a queer love story. And it is a tragic...
It's a beautiful...
It's incredible. It still holds up. It's an incredibly good movie. And every single actor in it, Anne Hathaway does an amazing job. Everybody in it portrays the emotion of the situation so beautifully. But it was shocking, I think, for people to kind of be confronted by that idea of these very masculine guys having these emotions and being okay with them and wanting, you know. And actually the movie is about toxic masculinity. It's about how they couldn't do it. They loved each other and still they couldn't. It wasn't enough. It's a really interesting portrayal of toxic masculinity, and I think an incredibly poignant choice to choose the cowboy to represent that.
Yes. Because like you say, I think it comes with the connotations. You don't need to paint the connotations when you start a film. Like, anything else, you might have to have something leading up to go, hey, remember, these things are associated with the stuff. While with cowboys, you just show them as cowboys and everyone already knows exactly all of the connotations that you are going to be flipping on its head.
Because like you said, the fandom of the cowboy... It's not the fandom in the same way as, say, you're a fan of Star Wars, you're a fan of comic books, all that kind of stuff. The fandom of the cowboy is almost like a sort of cult of the cowboy, you know? That it is its thing that, you know, a guy turning up to an event in, like, cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, he's going for a vibe, you know?
Yeah.
You know, you do that for your fancy dress costume or whatever. I mean, I think possibly it nowadays wouldn't necessarily be such a hyper masculine thing, I don't know, but definitely in the 90s and the early 2000s it was a very masculine kind of look, up there with lumberjacks, I would say. When you take something like that, like, people kind of really think about it. They love like Deadwood, like your Wyatt Earps, all that kind of stuff. People absolutely adore. We've talked about the spaghetti westerns, but they love those films, they love those stories. I'm also thinking about the sort of frontier TV shows we're seeing at the moment, like, I mean, Westworld it's not, it says it's sci-fi, but is it called like 18 something, the one that's Helen Mirren and they're out in the frontier.
Well, even like Firefly kind of embodied this idea, both in nature as well as visually.
And they're very hyper masculine imagery. They're very much like, this is what we do. We go out, we take over, all this kind of stuff. Even things like, I don't know if you either read or watched The Luminaries, which is actually set in New Zealand, but that same idea of these people who are going out and, you know, conquering the land kind of thing. And The Luminaries is really interesting because it looks at it from multiple different standpoints, including the Maori people who were just being there, didn't ask for any of this, because at some point we're going to have to talk about Native Americans and all of this and the portrayal of that, but I think I might defer to you slightly on those.
I was going to say, I think that a lot of, when you were talking about people getting upset with Brokeback Mountain, I immediately was remembering, I think it was 1973. I was looking it up so I could make sure I got it right. The 1973 Oscars, when Marlon Brando tried to attack Sacheen Littlefeather, who was standing up on the Oscars talking about how problematic the depiction of Native Americans were, the praise of the cowboys and the violence that those were portraying towards those people that was only helping to continue violence towards a marginalized group who were just, as you say with the Maori, they're just there. Like, you know? And so, but that was such a violent reaction to somebody saying, hey, this isn't cool. And that embodies so much of it, you know, when we talk about fandoms and fanboys kind of reacting so violently towards anything that is a slight alteration or a change or somebody saying, hey, this isn't okay. That was Marlon Brando in 1973.
Yeah.
Saying, how dare you say this about my fandom?
Yeah, and I feel like the same thing was true of the backlash to Brokeback Mountain. It was incredibly homophobic and violent. And there was so much being like, how dare you portray this like this? How this isn't what it, you know, all this kind of stuff. This isn't cowboys, blah, blah, blah. And I still see people with that. You know, we've had the film recently, the short film with Pedro Pascal and Ethan Hawke, which is gay cowboys again. And it's a beautiful short film. I can't quite remember what it's called. It will come to me. But again, the backlash to that was, this time it was slightly different. It was, they're just trying to get woke points. This is just two actors trying to show how, like, they're liberal and all this sort of thing. Rather than, like, the same kind of, the violent homophobic backlash that there was to Brokeback Mountain.
Yeah.
This one was clearly trying to use the language of the sort of far right and things in a slightly different way to be like, clearly you're just trying to get attention. Which I find fascinating, the change of how these attacks happen, the change of language towards it. But it was the same thing. It was the same thing of how dare you take cowboys, this thing that is super manly and out, all this kind of stuff, and country music, and, we go out and do the rodeo and all that kind of stuff, and it's so dangerous, and make it not that. Except it still is that, but gay men aren't allowed to be that.
Yeah.
But you're not allowed to be queer. You're not allowed to have, people who aren't exactly what we say they should be in this, which is the reaction of fandom to almost everything, as it turns out. But I find that fascinating. And again, we've had, like, I am very bad with names today, but there was a film recently doing a sort of reclamation of black cowboys, which I have got on my sort of watch list, but when you're like, I haven't sat down and watched it. But it looks incredible, and I think they did and they were all real people.
Yeah.
So that one was like a proper sort of, they say true story kind of thing. Obviously, it's a retelling of something that may or may not have happened.
I mean, you don't have to do too much with those. There's, for anyone who's interested, I'll link it. There was a really amazing podcast series that was short. I should check to see if there's any new episodes, but I think it was one of those, like, mini-series that was called Black Cowboys, and it was going through and did a load of those true stories, and they're insane stories, but it just shows how many of these people, and again, it's that idea of whitewashing it when, no, there were black cowboys, and there were gay cowboys, and a lot of those that they talked about were women, or at least were assigned female at birth, because some of them, I feel, they're not alive for me to question, but at the same time, they didn't have those options available to them, but the way they seemed to present themselves.
Yeah. And I think it's so fascinating, as we said at the beginning, that the cowboy historically, when you look at the stories, you look at the people who are there, is genuinely rebels and misfits and people looking to live different lives and wanting
reactions against oppression.
Absolutely. And it is incredibly sad that those stories are having to be reclaimed and retold and actually brought into the light because they have been completely silenced and overrun by this fandom made-up idea of what a cowboy is. And every time someone tries to tell those stories, whether it's about black cowboys, whether it's about queer cowboys, whether it's about women just being women, there has to be either a reason for it or there has to be a man there and you have to justify it and all this kind of stuff. Like, even the show with Helen Mirren, which will come to me, it's 18 something. Anyway, no, it's not. It's Yellowstone.
Oh.
Yellowstone, that's what it's called.
Is that Yellowstone?
Yeah. That one.
I see a billboard for it every so often.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting it mixed up with the...
I have been told to watch Yellowstone. I need to get my head in the gear of watching actual shows again, but...
Even that one, the character of... Helen Mirren's character, they're real people, right? These are based on... Even in that, there kind of has to be a justification for when she gets angry, gets a gun, and all this kind of stuff. Like, somehow she's not allowed to...
Well, and there has to be... I think what is also kind of annoying is that these representations of the black cowboys or the women cowboys have to be based on a true story in order to justify, when you could just have a fictional black cowboy. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can do that.
Yeah.
But in order to justify doing that, they have to say, oh, no, really? This was real.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, of course it was, but you have to do that. But again, it's because it doesn't matter what the history is. And this is something that I always have to stress when I was teaching. I don't teach anymore, so I can't use present tense. But when I would teach, I always had to stress a lot of the times whenever we were talking about myth classes or we were just talking about stories in general, is that, and belief in general, is that the reality of a situation is not important.
No.
The history is not important. What's important is the perception of that.
Yeah.
And that is what has happened to cowboys. It's a demonstration of the fact that the actual history no longer matters to anybody who cares about cowboys.
Yeah.
well, I wouldn't say that. For the majority of the Cowboy fans,
yeah,
they don't really care about the history. They're not liking Cowboys because of the history of Cowboys. They like the perception and the story of Cowboys, and that's what they draw to.
And it's quite interesting because I would say that in many cases, the people who actually know the real history are the ones who are still ranching, are the ones who are still doing rodeo, or all, you know, that kind of thing. And maybe not generationally, because, you know, obviously we live in a society. But a lot of the people who are doing it now are looking back to where these things came from, and they are looking to understand it. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I'm not saying that everybody is involved in those communities is doing that. But one is seeing a change in understanding what and where these things came from. You know, it's a different world now where people are actually trying to learn the history. And it's not perfect, because of course it's not. But I think that small change, and the fact there are podcasts out there educating people about this, even though they're having to justify it like, this is true, this is real, this happened, rather than just being able to say, like...
I mean, it's part of changing the story. We've talked about this a lot, and I will continue to talk about it. I will talk about this until I am dead. But stories and myths can change. That's what makes them really fascinating to study. Yeah. If they all stayed the same, and it was all the same story, and it was all the same variant, it wouldn't be interesting. And so what people are having to do now is change that myth, and that does take sometimes going back and demonstrating the connections.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes just reclaiming and doing your own thing with it. It takes somebody like Lil Nas X to do their own version of it, to have a gay black man doing a cowboy. He wasn't out at the time, but he's out now.
Yeah.
And he be proud.
Yeah.
And, you know, it takes somebody like that reclaiming the image of the cowboy and the song of the cowboy and the representation of the cowboy and doing it in their own way.
Absolutely. And there is definitely a way of also telling cowboy stories without... We've talked about, like, Han Solo, but things like the Guardians of the Galaxy, Firefly. These are cowboy stories, right? They're the same kind of idea. And it's worth telling those stories where you can literally go, it's in space, it's not real, and changing the narrative there as well. Because like all of those, you can pinpoint which character is the cowboy. It's Mal... Is it Reynolds? Yes, the main character in Firefly.
Sure.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Nathan Fillion,
yeah. That's who... You know, it's him, and it's... You know, it's Han Solo, it's Chris Pratt, who... Star-Lord, there we go. I remember things from Marvel films, what? These characters are very clearly the cowboy guy. But what happens when you make that character not that guy? You know, you change it up a bit, you play with it a bit. That, I think, is a very interesting and slightly different story to tell. And we're seeing that start to happen. As much as I don't think it was a particularly great film, the one that just came out on Netflix, that is a Western set in space by... Oh my goodness, I'm terrible with names today.
I cannot help you. I'm so out of TV space right now. I've just been watching Taskmaster.
Zack Snyder, the new Zack Snyder
film.
Right. He has... I mean, I don't particularly like Zack Snyder as a director, but it looks like he's tried. There is an effort being made to change this perception. And
that's like one of the worst insults you can give a piece of work or an artist. It's like, well, it looks like you tried.
But the thing is, if Zack fucking Snyder is going to make it look like he tried, everyone should be looking like they tried, you know? You know, I kind of feel like of all the people to be like, well, okay, cool, that's an effort being made there, Zack Snyder, you know, king of the dude bros. That's astonishing. I mean, I don't think it's not a good film. Does that matter if it's necessarily like trying to change a narrative perception? I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing because every time we see someone try and make these changes to these stories, Star Wars, you get the backlash. And so it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, people get to, I guess, particularly people who are more, less from marginalized communities become more scared to do that because they're not used to having that kind of backlash in the way that people from that are kind of like, yeah, of course I'm going to get that backlash. I'm black. You know, that's kind of what they're used to.
Absolutely.
While white people, particularly white men like Zack Snyder, would not be used to having that happen in quite the same way.
And I think it's very interesting to see those changes try to be made to these kinds of stories. I can't think of anything off the top of my head where I feel like a fantasy or made up fictional cowboy story has really tried to push those boundaries more than Brokeback Mountain did, or even just try and change it up that the main character just isn't a white dude. Yeah. You know, they've changed the cast around him, but the white dude in the middle remains because we can't quite get away from that. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, that even though Firefly, I mean, Joss Whedon, and Guardians of the Galaxy and all of these things and Star Wars, they are changing the cast around these main characters. Those main characters are still very much one type of person. And it's difficult to change that main character without getting... I mean, the backlash is happening just for changing the side characters and how they come, you know. So I cannot imagine how hard it is to even pitch something where you're changing that main character in the story. I think, weirdly, because I would compare cowboys and pirates to each other, pirates have managed it. Pirates seem to have pretty much managed to start to change that dynamic.
But pirates don't have the same nationalism tied to them. Because I think that's an element of cowboys that cannot be denied, is that particularly in America, it's not just tied to kind of cis masculinity. It's also tied to Americana. Yeah. And what it is to be an American. And therefore, it has this kind of nationalistic hold. Yeah. In a way that pirates don't have any country to do that.
No, that's true. It's very...
I mean, they should. Like, I think Britain can claim them.
Yeah, so could Spain and the Netherlands.
Yeah, but you beat the Spanish Armada thanks to the pirates. You can claim pirates.
They're ours, bitch.
So, you know, but it's interesting that you haven't.
That's
fascinating to me.
Because I think maybe we don't... Like, in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, but pirates, like, the Caribbean, obviously. And, like I
but you were British.
Yeah, except... And the Netherlands definitely have a big pirate thing going on. And most of Europe, in fact. But pirates were so mixed. So many people became pirates for so many different reasons. Because they were escaping navies, or they were slaves, or they were women, or it's all the same.
But you're doing the thing. You're doing the thing of going back to the history. History doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's true.
But because same thing could be said for cowboys. Yeah. But what happened was what pop culture did to cowboys. But I think it just happened early enough where pirates, that's happening now. Yeah. Like, I think Pirates of the Caribbean is one of the first, like, really big...
because like I'm
blockbustery pirate film. While we have a long history.
I mean, I would argue Treasure Island.
Fair.
And so, but I think also the thing is, the reason the British I don't think claim pirates is because for a long time pirates were the bad guys. That you were the British Navy. And the British
cowboys were never.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the British Navy came in and they sorted it out. Whereas I think cowboys were like, no, we're gonna get that dirty lawman and we're gonna be free and we're in charge, you know. So I think because America always had this thing of like the little guy standing up or whatever, in inverted commas, massively, so they had that thing of like, oh no, we're gonna come in and stop the law guy, the British, essentially. We're the Americans and we're going to take what's ours. This is not necessarily a good story.
It's the idea of the good guy with a gun.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think in a lot of the stories about pirates, up until very recently, the pirates were not the good guy. Yeah. The pirates were the bad guy. Or the pirates were the morally grey, slightly worrying character. You know, I'm thinking of things like Dr. Sin, which I am aware that probably only I've read. And he is, story of Dr. Sin, because it's fascinating. It's about that long. I'm doing a little thing. It's about an inch width of book. And Dr. Sin is a vicar? Parson? Priest? I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, he must be a vicar of some description. Anyway, he is a religious man who is having a nice life, and he gets married to this woman that he loves and all this kind of stuff. She runs off with a dude who's no good. You know, he seduces her, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And Dr. Sin decides to follow her. And he ends up falling in with a load of pirates and basically becomes a pirate himself, becomes known as Captain Clegg, and chases this woman to the end of the earth, and in the end it's not worth it and all this sort of stuff. And so he decides, oh my god, what have I done, kind of thing, comes back to England, ends up in Cornwall and Devon, that kind of area, settles down as the local vicar, parson, whatever, realises the people here are smuggling, and rather than turning them into the authorities, he's like, nah, you're poor, I'm going to help you because I'm a pirate. And so he then becomes a smuggler called the Scarecrow, helping these guys out. And it's a really odd story. It's fascinating, but it's very clearly a morally grey story about not, like, being against authority and all this sort of stuff. At every turn, he decides to reject authority despite the fact that he should be the one representing it. And that is the first time I really came across a story about pirates where you weren't necessarily meant to root for them all. Like, loads of the pirates are clearly bad, but he's the good guy. He's the good guy with the gun, right?
Yeah.
Because he's a religious man, but he's decided to go and do this, and he knows where the line is, and all that kind of stuff. It's the same idea. I find it, these kinds of characters, the person, he's like, I'm the anti-hero, Cowboys are anti-heroes, right? And that's the kind of same sort of thing. And I wonder whether, essentially, the stories of pirates up until that kind of thing, and even Treasure Island and stuff, were very much, pirates are bad guys, we're the British, we're going to come in, we're going to deal with it. Because that's the narrative that the British Empire wanted to put across.
Yeah.
And so that may be why we're only now seeing it, and also why there is no like, the British aren't going to claim pirates.
Yeah.
Because we kind of can't now, and I think because it's happening now, people know they can't. Whereas in the past, when it might have happened, they were like, no, no, no. Here are our big boats. We fight the pirates. We're the good guys. You know? Which we weren't. We were not the good guys ever.
Francis Drake popping out. You're like, shush, 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 shush.
Privateer. Shush, shush. You know, what? No. But I think that might be the slight difference between pirates and cowboys.
Yeah.
And also the difference between the American ownership of cowboys and why we don't have it in Europe with any country, you know, because why would we? At the time these stories were being told, they were exciting and interesting, in the same way that we don't really claim highwaymen or anything like that. Like, any of these kind of, I would call them the same kind of folk mythological figure as the cowboy, you know, your Dick Turpins, all that kind of stuff. They're mythological figures. They weren't real, but they were never good guys. They were kind of exciting because they were criminals.
They were the criminal outlaw.
Exactly.
Like a Robin Hood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Robin Hood. We've claimed him.
Yeah, you got Robin Hood.
We've got King Arthur, too. We're fine. We don't need a cowboy.
But you do, like, it's really weird because it's all like, singular figures, like Robin Hood, but not... And while people used historically again, people used the name Robin Hood whenever they didn't want to put their actual name down when they were arrested, so it became a like name Sorrow. That people use. But there's not, like, a group of Robin Hoods.
No. No, exactly. And I mean, I suppose you have the Knights of the Round Table, but they're all individual characters.
Yeah.
So I think that is possibly the difference.
Yeah.
That we don't have a collective...
And there's just something weird about the American mindset that, if I understood, I would probably still be living there, that is that lone figure, the lone good guy with a gun, as being the embodiment of America.
And that's what they think they are.
They really do.
Like, it's... we're going to go into a conversation about the American mindset. I don't think I'm prepared for that.
I think we're 44 minutes in. Probably not.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, we're good.
And maybe we should wait till I have citizenship here in case they tell me I can't go back.
Yeah, no, we'll do that.
As soon as I start complaining. I've already been told many, many times that I'm too un-American by Americans. So, you know, we'll just really stick the nail in that coffin with that discussion.
But I think, actually, if we're talking about it, like, Captain America's the same, right?
Yeah.
Captain America's the lone guy going in.
He's the cowboy?
He is.
We love cowboys.
But it's interesting because I don't think Superman is.
No.
Superman isn't a cowboy. Superman's a Boy Scout. He's the good guy, but he's the good guy.
Yeah.
And I think it's...
He's the good cop. See, there's... There's bad cops and there's good cops, and both can be praised.
Batman.
In America, in pop culture. I need to stress this.
Superman's the good cop and Batman's the bad cop.
Exactly.
You know.
And Batman's the cowboy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he is.
See, that's what the cowboys are, the bad cops.
Yeah.
But they're still fighting for justice. They'll just do it rough.
Yeah.
Which is why bad cops can't get actually arrested now. Like, because they're the cowboys.
Oh, that's not good.
Yes, this is the problem. Yeah. Again, we're not going to get too into it, but...
but again, if we're going to talk about it, that's Die Hard, right? That's every Tom Cruise movie ever.
And this is the Private Eyes and the, oh my god, I cannot remember his name now. The big one that's in Maltese Falcon that's used in all of the Noirs. Sam Spade. Yes, Sam Spade is, although he's not technically a cop, he's the bad cop figure, he's the cowboy. And I was just reading Chester Himes, who is a black author that did black bad cops, cowboys, and so it just is Luther.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it's the time for Ollie to mention Terry Pratchett, because obviously I
should have a sound cue that I play as like a little like it's the podcast where Ollie talks about Pratchett,
because Terry Pratchett dissects that character, right, in Sam Vimes. Sam Vimes is the bad cop, except he knows he's the bad cop, and he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to beat people up to get information. He wants to stop himself, because if he doesn't stop himself, nobody will. And I find that really interesting, that Sam Vimes is eventually, not to start with, he's more of a stereotype, but eventually he is a deconstruction of a man who realizes that's not okay to be that person, and being that person, and if you are the law, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And I find that really, really interesting, because by the end, he's happily married with a kid and settled down and no longer drinks alcohol, and, you know, he's the guy in charge, and he signs off the forms and makes sure everyone's doing it properly. He becomes the chief, the character you're not meant to like, because he stops the you know, the bad cop going off half-cocked. You know, and I think that's really interesting as a dissection, but he always knows in the back of his head that thing can come out, and he has to control it.
It must be, because I just find it fascinating that this kind of Americana idea that is so embedded in Americans everywhere is being shipped out to other countries, and they're taking it.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that you do have Luther, which is an English show, you have Terry Pratchett kind of deconstructing this idea, and he's English, and you have all of these figures, I'm sure there's ones in other countries, I've just lived in the two, but that are all kind of taking it in and either responding to it in their own formulations of it, or copying it.
Yeah. Though, I don't know if it's necessarily in the UK, because the UK and America, while they are completely different cultures, there is a cultural exchange there. Because what is James Bond?
Yeah, I guess.
You know, we have spy movies. We have a big thing of the history of the army and spies and the Secret Service and all that kind of thing. That's a big thing with us.
There's something about James Bond that doesn't feel cowboy.
No, he's
in
not
the way that Luther feels cowboy.
But he's been changed. Like, you think about the most recent movies, he's going off doing his own thing and all that kind of stuff, and he's not following the... But I do wonder whether...
I wonder if it's because he's too clean.
Maybe.
He's too posh.
But yeah, this is it. Like, I don't know whether actually some of our stories are actually a mishmash of those ideas. Yeah. Because James Bond is so quintessentially British.
It is, yes.
You can't look at that and not say, yeah, that's how Brits think about themselves. Let's be honest, if Americans think they're the cowboy, we think we're the spy.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
That's what The Man from U.N.C.L.E. is.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of stories.
You have Jean Le Carre.
Yeah. Exactly. So I kind of feel like if you're going to look at... we're not pirates, we're spies.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. We're going to need to start doing this with every country. So
please send in a list.
I'm aware that we have listeners from other countries because I see the demographics.
Yeah.
Send in your cultural stereotype.
Yeah, I mean, I think the US kind of has this thing of being the cop of the world, but it's the bad cop. It's the cowboy. Yes. You know, it's the Lone Ranger.
Definitely the bad cop.
Yay. If we're going kind of back to the idea at the beginning of this kind of what is a cowboy, I think that is, at the end of it, the cowboy is a stereotype of the person who you trust to hold the gun. You know? The person who, while everyone else is a bad guy and they're shooting things up, this is the person who knows when it's right to do it. He knows when it's right to pull the trigger. And that, I think, is why you come back to the samurai. The samurai is the person who does the one movement. And that's it. The problem is solved. You know, that is the idea. And I think that is probably why the American consciousness has grabbed onto it so much and turned it into what it is and made it rough and tumble and, you know, all that kind of thing. Because, you know, cowboys are not a samurai. A samurai is controlled. A cowboy isn't in the same way, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's a very interesting way to look at it, is to break it down to those little parts. And I think that is why it has a fandom, why it has a cultural zeitgeist around cowboyness. And particularly why it appeals to a certain form of masculinity and then gets changed into other forms of masculinity. Because if the man is meant to come into the situation and fix it, you think about the stereotype of what a man is meant to be. He's the breadwinner, he sorts things, he looks after everybody, all that kind of stuff. And a cowboy does that, and he does it in his own, the cowboy, does it in their own way, in their own thing, and everybody loves them for it. But they don't have the stress. And so I can totally see, particularly an American view of the nuclear family and all that kind of stuff, and what manly Americanness is meant to be, that the cowboy is the perfect representation of that. Even more so than the bad cop or the good cop or whatever. Even more so than any of those stereotypes of if you think of masculine stereotypes like a soldier, a cop, a sailor, all this kind of thing, you know, these characters, a spy, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I'll just put that in there. But, you know, even more than all of that, the cowboy is a quintessentially perfect idea of how to be a man. And I think that is why it has the power it has. End of episode. Done. Mic drop.
And they have penises and look at each other.
Oh, yes. It's all very, very homoerotic. Because actually, that's the other thing, is the cowboy can come and have an affair and all this sort of stuff, right? He can make love to a beautiful woman, blah, 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 blah. But at the end, he goes back to his mates. Yeah. Because I think a lot of men, they want to go back to their... That's why it's homoerotic, right? At the end of the day, the strongest relationships are with your boys. With your boys. With the guys who back you up, the ones who die for you in a fight, all that kind of stuff. Because the objectification of women is powerful. Okay, I'm going to go off on one if we don't stop now. Please end the episode, Vivian.
Okay, how do we end episodes?
Awkwardly.
I will definitely be linking that book. It was a recent publication, I think like 2022 or 23. That was the collection of pop culture and cowboys. There were some really fascinating chapters, so definitely grab that from your local library if you can.
I will try and remember the names of the things that I referenced that I couldn't remember the names of, particularly the film with Pedro Pascal and Ethan Hawke.
Yes.
Which everyone should watch. And
get ready for a lot of cowboy references in the description.
Yeah, basically anything we've referenced and talked about, Yellowstone, Brokeback Mountain, we'll
try to remember.
Yeah.
I'll write it down as I edit.
Excellent. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something out of this. I hope if you have any of your own ideas about cowboys or whatever, please let us know. Please send us things you think we should read about these topics as well. We would love to always go back into these things.
love to extend my reading list. And send us your cultural stereotype figurehead.
Yeah. And also, because it's the end of an episode and I am contractually obliged to do this, please buy my book from any good bookshop. It's called A History of Fans and Fandom from Pen and Sword. You can get it pretty much everywhere. It's out now.
Woo!
Woo! It's really good, says me. If you like these kinds of ramblings, you're going to like it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I have, as always, been Holly Swinyard.
And I have, as always, been Vivian Asimos.
Bye,
guys! Bye!
Thanks for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, and fellow fans and get the word out. You can follow us on social media, links in the show notes, as are some links to further reading. Who doesn't like a reading list? We are nerds after all. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribute 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian, Asimos, and Holly Swinyard.
Should my item be YEEHAW?